there is a very specific moment in the life of someone who uses a credit card that almost no one admits out loud. But that happens in a lot of people's minds. That exact second when you open your banking app to look at your statement and feel a slight tension before the number even appears on the screen, as if your brain were trying to prepare itself for information that may be completely normal, but at the same time carries a strange psychological weight. Because unlike other bills in life, a credit card bill rarely represents just a number. It represents past decisions, moments of exhaustion, small purchases made without much thought, and a silent sequence of choices that, when they build up, start taking up far more space in your mind than they should. What is curious is that almost no one starts using a credit card imagining that it could become a psychological or emotional problem, because most of the time the card enters a person's life as exactly the opposite of that, almost like a modern and smart solution for dealing with money, something that seems to bring more control, more organization, and even a sense of security, especially when you look at that approved limit and think that now, if something unexpected happens, you have room to maneuver that simply did not exist before. But there is an extremely subtle change that happens inside people's minds when the card becomes part of their financial routine. A change so discreet that most people cannot identify the exact moment when it began. Because before the card, any purchase automatically came with a very simple and extremely concrete question. Do I actually have this money right now? While after the card enters the picture, that question stops being the main filter and is replaced by another one that is much softer and seemingly harmless. Will this fit on the statement? That small change in the question seems irrelevant when you look at it superficially. But in practice, it completely changes the way the brain makes financial decisions, because when the question is whether you have the money right now, the decision is tied directly to the present reality of your financial life. While when the question becomes whether something will fit on the statement, the decision starts leaning on a perception of future money, on space that has not actually been paid for yet, and that, for that very reason, feels much lighter in your mind. And it is exactly at that point that one of the most uncomfortable truths about credit cards begins, something that is rarely explained clearly to people who are just starting to use one. The card does not just change how you pay for things, it changes how your brain perceives the weight of financial decisions. Because when the consequence of a purchase stops happening at the same moment the purchase is made, the brain loses an important part of the natural mechanism that normally helps control impulses. Think about an ordinary day in real life, the kind that seems completely normal when you look at it from the outside, but that on the inside is full of small invisible pressures. You wake up early, deal with transportation, solve problems at work, answer messages, manage other people's expectations, make dozens of small decisions throughout the day, and when late afternoon or evening finally comes, your mind is no longer operating with the same level of mental energy it had at the beginning of the day. In that state of mental exhaustion, the brain naturally starts looking for easier ways to handle whatever decision comes next. Because making decisions requires psychological energy, and when that energy starts to drop, the natural tendency of the human mind is to reduce effort whenever possible. That is exactly where the credit card fits perfectly into human behavior, because it removes almost all the friction from the buying process, eliminating the need to rearrange the budget at that moment, eliminating the need to decide which part of the available money that amount will come from, and even eliminating the immediate feeling of loss that normally happens when payment is made with cash or debit. What is left in its place is only the feeling of quickly solving the problem, a small mental relief that happens at the moment of purchase and makes the brain register that experience as something positive, simple, and efficient, without realizing that the financial consequence of that decision has been quietly pushed a few weeks ahead, to the moment when the statement finally arrives. When the statement shows up, however, it does not bring just one isolated purchase that you can calmly analyze. It brings a set of decisions spread across several different days, made in completely different contexts of your life. Some made when you were tired. Others made when the amount seemed too small to worry about. Others made at moments when solving something quickly seemed more important than calmly reflecting on the financial impact. Separately, each of those decisions seemed small, almost irrelevant. But when they all show up together on the same statement, the final amount often feels disconnected from the memory you have of the individual purchases, creating that strange feeling that the total number is bigger than what you remember spending. That feeling does not happen because you forgot what you bought, nor because you do not know how to do math, but because the credit card creates a psychological distance between the moment of the decision and the moment of the financial consequence, and the human brain simply was not designed to deal well with that kind of delay between action and result. Now imagine an ordinary person living through a completely normal month of adult life with no financial disaster happening, no job loss, no huge medical emergency. Just the typical routine that millions of people face every day, waking up early, working, trying to balance bills, trying to maintain some stability while life keeps demanding small decisions all the time. Because it is precisely within that seemingly calm routine that the credit card begins to reveal the real effect it has on people's minds. At the beginning of the month, everything seems organized. Because the paycheck has just hit the account, the main bills have been paid, and there is that temporary feeling that things are finally under control. A feeling that does not last long, but that is still enough for the brain to relax a little, as if for a few days the financial pressure had eased. And it is exactly in that small interval of calm that the most automatic financial decisions begin to happen without anyone noticing the accumulated weight they can create. Maybe a small purchase comes up that had seemed necessary for a while, something you had been putting off, and that now seems perfectly justifiable to take care of. Maybe it is something for the house, something for work, a digital subscription that seemed useful, or even a food delivery order on a particularly exhausting day. Decisions that individually seem completely reasonable in that specific moment really do not seem capable of causing any kind of meaningful financial problem. What makes the credit card so powerful in this process is precisely the fact that each of those decisions happens in isolation inside the mind. Because when you confirm a purchase on credit, the impact of that choice is not immediately registered by the brain as a concrete loss of money, which makes that decision emotionally lighter than it would be if the amount were coming out of the account at that moment. That creates a curious phenomenon in human behavior, because when the pain of paying is delayed, the decision to spend becomes easier to repeat, and when something easy starts repeating over days and weeks, it slowly turns into an invisible pattern inside the person's financial routine. During that process, most people do not notice any dramatic change happening, because there is no big, irresponsible purchase serving as a clear warning sign that something has gotten out of control. What actually exists is a sequence of small decisions that seem completely justifiable when analyzed individually, but that, when added together, begin to create a financial situation that is much more complex than it looked at the beginning of the month. That is why so many people live through a very similar experience with credit cards, an experience that is rarely described in dramatic terms. But that shows up as a constant kind of mental vigilance over finances, a feeling that there is always something on the financial horizon that still needs to be handled, something that will still show up on the next statement, something that was decided weeks ago and is now approaching the surface of financial life again. That feeling creates a kind of anxiety that is not explosive, but persistent, an anxiety that shows up in small moments during the day, like when you receive a bank notification when someone mentions a bigger purchase they intend to make, or when you simply decide to open the app to check how much has already accumulated on the statement up to that point. What is curious is that many people interpret that feeling as if it were just a lack of financial organization, as if the problem was simply not tracking the numbers with more discipline. But the truth is that something much deeper is happening behind that behavior, something that has less to do with spreadsheets and much more to do with how the human brain reacts when consumption is separated from the financial consequence by a stretch of time. The human brain evolved to respond quickly to immediate rewards and immediate consequences, because for most of human history, important decisions were directly connected to the present moment. Eating now meant survival. Avoiding danger now meant staying alive. And for that reason, the brain's emotional system became extremely efficient at dealing with outcomes that appear right after decisions. The problem is that the credit card creates the exact opposite scenario, a scenario in which the reward of the purchase happens immediately, while the financial consequence is hidden in the future. And when the brain gets the reward now, but does not feel the loss now, it records that experience as something positive that can be repeated again. That psychological mechanism does not automatically turn someone into a person in debt, but it gradually changes the way financial decisions are perceived over time, making it easier to say yes to small purchases and reducing the natural sense of limit that would normally exist if each payment were directly connected to the money available at that moment. As the months go by, that pattern creates a kind of financial environment in which several decisions from the past continue, living in the person's present at the same time, installments that are still running, purchases that will still show up on the next statement, small subscriptions that keep being charged automatically, and a series of financial commitments that were born at different moments in life, but that now coexist simultaneously within the same financial reality. When that scenario takes shape, the person often begins to feel a sensation that is hard to explain, a feeling that money always seems to arrive already assigned to something, as if part of it were already committed before it even hits the account. Because in practice, it really is committed by decisions that were made weeks or even months earlier. That is the point when many people start asking themselves why they work so hard, try so hard to keep life organized, and still feel that money never seems completely free, as if there were always a part of it that already belongs to the past, tied to choices that were made when the financial impact seemed too far away to worry about. And this is where one of the most important insights about the relationship between ordinary people and credit cards appears, an insight that is rarely discussed in depth, because the conversation about credit cards almost always revolves only around interest and debt, when in reality, the quietest effect of credit happens long before any mispayment or serious problem. The real effect begins when the card starts taking up space inside the person's mind, when it stops being just a payment method and starts becoming a parallel system that needs to be followed, monitored, and constantly managed, consuming mental attention that could be used in other areas of life. That mental wear and tear is so common that many people simply start accepting it as a normal part of adult life, as if feeling a slight tension when dealing with money were something inevitable, when in reality that tension is often born exactly from the way credit reorganizes the timing of financial decisions, mixing past, present, and future inside the same statement. When someone begins to understand this mechanism, something very interesting happens inside that person's mind, because for the first time it becomes clear that the problem was never just spending more or spending less, but understanding how the financial environment silently influences behavior over time. And when that understanding appears, an extremely important question also comes up, one that almost no one asks at the beginning of financial life. Should the goal of money be only to pay bills and buy things? Or is the real goal of money to create enough mental peace that life's decisions stop being made under constant pressure? That question completely changes the way someone starts seeing the role of the credit card in their own life, because it shifts the focus away from the pure math of finances to something much deeper, which is the quality of the psychological relationship each person builds with their own money. If you pay very close attention to the way people talk about money in everyday life, you will notice a curious pattern that almost no one questions, because it seems so normal to be analyzed in depth. A pattern in which the credit card is rarely treated as a tool that needs to be used consciously, but rather as a kind of natural extension of modern financial life. Something that is always there, available, ready to solve any small need that appears along the way. That normalization of the card is so strong that many people spend years using credit without ever stopping to reflect on an extremely simple, but at the same time extremely powerful question. If the card disappeared from your life tomorrow, would your financial organization continue working exactly the same way? Or would you realize that a large part of your spending decisions depends on the existence of that available limit? That question usually causes a small internal discomfort when someone truly thinks about it honestly, because the answer often reveals something that has been hidden inside the financial routine for a long time. Something that does not show up in a dramatic way, but that manifests as a silent dependence on credit to maintain the feeling of normalcy in the flow of monthly spending. When that dependence starts to form, the card stops being just one option among several forms of payment and starts becoming the default path for handling practically any kind of expense that comes up in everyday life, from small, seemingly irrelevant purchases to bigger expenses that are put into installments so the monthly impact feels softer inside the budget. The problem is that installment payments create an extremely powerful illusion inside the human mind because they turn large amounts into small numbers. And small numbers are much easier to accept emotionally than large numbers, even when the total amount being committed over time is exactly the same. Imagine, for example, that someone is considering a purchase of 1,000 reais, an amount that for many people represents a decision that would require reflection, planning, and maybe even a few days of waiting before confirming the purchase. Because 1,000 reais are perceived by the brain as a significant amount of money. Now imagine that this same purchase is presented in a different way, no longer as 1,000 reais up front, but as 10 installments of 100 reais spread out over almost an entire year. Suddenly, the psychological weight of the decision changes completely, because 100 reais feels much lighter than 1,000, even though the final financial result is exactly the same. And it is in that kind of distortion that installment payments find their quietest strength. The human brain does not evaluate financial decisions based only on math. It evaluates decisions based on perceived effort, perceived loss, and perceived immediate impact on everyday life. When a purchase is split into installments, the immediate impact seems small, almost irrelevant within the monthly budget. And that makes the decision get approved much more quickly by the mind. as if that choice were not really committing a significant part of future money. What many people do not realize is that each installment represents a promise made to the future, a small obligation that does not yet exist in the present, but that will inevitably show up in the coming months, taking up space inside income that has not even arrived yet. When only a few installments are running at the same time, that dynamic can even seem completely manageable. But when several installment decisions begin to coexist within the same financial life, something curious happens. The person's future starts becoming more and more committed by choices made in the past. That is the moment when the money for the month stops being completely free, because part of it is already reserved to pay for decisions that were made weeks or months earlier. Decisions that may not even seem that important when remembered on their own, but that remain alive inside the statements that arrive every month. This phenomenon creates a feeling that many people describe in very similar ways. Even if they have never talked to each other about it, the feeling that the money hits the account already, as if it does not have time to simply exist there for a few days before it starts being divided among commitments, that we're already waiting for it. When that feeling settles permanently into someone's financial life, the relationship with money begins to change deeply, because money stops representing peace or freedom and starts representing constant responsibility, constant monitoring, constant attention. It is as if each new month begins with a small, invisible list of things that already need to be paid before new decisions can even be made. And that list often includes installments from purchases that were made at completely different moments in the person's life. One purchase made in a moment of excitement, another made in a moment of exhaustion, another made in a moment when it seemed useful or necessary. Decisions that individually seem simple, but that when they all remain alive at the same time inside the budget create a feeling of permanent financial weight. That is one of the reasons why so many people work, make an effort, receive their paycheck at the end of the month, and still feel that they can never experience that sense of financial lightness they imagined they would have when they started adult life. They are not necessarily seriously in debt. They are not living through a dramatic financial crisis. But they also cannot feel that the money truly belongs to them in that moment, because a significant part of it is always committed to the past. And when the past keeps taking up space in someone's financial present, the future starts to feel tighter and tighter, because any new financial goal, whether it is building a reserve, investing, changing your life, or simply breathing more as Ali, has to compete with old decisions that are still being paid for. That competition between past and future within the same money is one of the quietest effects of constant credit use, because it creates a financial structure in which time stops working in the person's favor and starts working against them. Each new installment extends the presence of an old decision for a few more months, which means that the impact of that choice continues influencing financial life long after the initial excitement of the purchase has completely disappeared. When someone finally notices this pattern, an uncomfortable question often comes up, one that rarely appears at the beginning of the financial journey. How many of the things I am paying for today are really still making a difference in my life? That question carries enormous weight, because it reveals something many people prefer not to face directly. A large part of the installments occupying the current budget were created by decisions that seemed important at the time, but that today have already lost much of the meaning they had when they were made. Even so, the financial commitment remains active, reminding you every month that that choice is still alive inside the statement, taking up space inside income that could be used in completely different ways in the present. It is exactly at that point that some people begin to realize that the real challenge of the credit card is not just avoiding interest or avoiding large debts, but rather understanding how credit reorganizes the timing of financial decisions, allowing choices from the past to keep influencing the freedom of the present for much longer than would be possible in an immediate payment system. When that perception finally becomes clear, something starts to change in the way the person sees their own financial behavior. Because for the first time, it becomes obvious that controlling money does not just mean earning more or spending less, but also understanding how each decision made today can continue taking up space inside tomorrow's financial life. And it is exactly at that point in the journey that many people begin to realize that the relationship with a credit card was never just a matter of discipline or lack of discipline, but rather a matter of financial architecture, of environment, of how the tools we use every day quietly shape the way we make decisions. There's a very specific moment in a person's relationship with a credit card that is almost never noticed when it happens. A moment that does not come with a warning, a financial scare, or an obvious crisis. But that still marks a deep change in the way money starts circulating within that person's life, because it is exactly at that point that credit stops being just an occasional resource and starts turning into a structural part of the financial routine. That change happens in an extremely quiet way, precisely because it does not depend on one big decision or one obvious mistake, but rather on a set of small behaviors that start repeating month after month, until the brain begins to consider it completely normal to handle a significant part of expenses using money that has not been received yet. At first, this seems completely harmless, because the first experiences with the card usually happen in a controlled scenario, where purchases are still few, the installments are still small, and the available limit always seems much bigger than the amount being used. During that initial period, the person looks at their financial life and feels that everything is under control. After all the statements are being paid, the limit is not even close to running out, and there is a feeling that the card is simply making money management easier, allowing purchases to be spread throughout the month or broken into installments when necessary. What almost no one notices is that during that same period when everything seems calm, the brain is learning a new pattern of financial behavior, a pattern in which solving problems with credit becomes increasingly automatic. Imagine a month in which an unexpected expense comes up, something relatively common in adult life, like a repair in the house, car maintenance, a medical appointment, or any other kind of situation that requires money at a moment that was not exactly planned. If the person has a credit card available, the solution seems simple and immediate because the limit is there precisely for that, allowing the problem to be solved right then and there without having to reorganize the whole month's budget. The emotional experience that the brain registers in that moment is extremely important because it associates the credit card with the feeling of relief, as if that tool had solved a difficult situation quickly and efficiently. From that point on, the card begins to occupy a different psychological role in the person's life, no longer being just a payment method and instead being perceived as a kind of invisible safety net, something that is always there to absorb any unexpected financial pressure that appears along the way. The problem is that when the brain begins to trust that safety net, it also begins to relax in relation to other forms of financial protection that would be much healthier in the long run. The person stops feeling as much urgency to build an emergency fund because deep down there is a sense that the card can play that role if something goes off plan. That exchange seems small when it happens, but it profoundly changes the structure of financial life over time, because an emergency fund represents money that already exists and fully belongs to the person, while the card limit represents money that will still have to be paid back in the future. As long as that difference is not clearly perceived, the card continues being used as a solution for situations that ideally should be handled with money that is already available. As the months go by, that behavior creates a very curious dynamic inside the person's financial life, because every time a small pressure appears in the month's budget, the card shows up as a convenient release valve. A bill bigger than expected, a necessary purchase that was not in the plan, an expense that feels too urgent to wait until the next paycheck. Each of those situations reinforces the same mental pattern. Using credit solves the problem now, and payment can be figured out later. What makes this cycle so difficult to notice is that it does not necessarily cause an immediate financial collapse. The person keeps working, keeps receiving a paycheck, keeps paying the statements. And from the outside, life seems to keep functioning normally. But inside the financial structure, something important has already changed, because present money has started depending more and more on future money. When that dependence settles in permanently, the card stops being an occasional tool and starts becoming a fixed part of how the financial month operates. The paycheck comes in, the basic bills are paid, part of the statement is paid off, and the cycle starts again with new purchases being made on credit while the next statement begins taking shape. For many people, this process happens for years without them realizing that they are stuck on a kind of financial treadmill, a system in which money is always circulating, but rarely manages to stop long enough to create real stability. That treadmill creates a very common feeling among people who use cards often, the feeling that money can never breathe. It comes in and goes out so quickly, always connected to past and future decisions at the same time, that it seems impossible to reach a point where financial life is truly calm. When someone begins to analyze this pattern more closely, a realization comes up that tends to be uncomfortable at first, but extremely liberating once it is understood. The realization that the real problem with the credit card was never just the amount of the purchases made with it, but the structural role it came to occupy within the organization of money. As long as the card occupies the place of the solution for any financial squeeze, the person continues depending on credit to keep their financial life functioning normally. And when a financial life depends on credit to function, any small instability, a bigger expense, a lower income, a somewhat more expensive unexpected event can quickly turn an apparently stable situation into a much tighter one. That is why so many people feel a kind of invisible fragility in their own financial life, even when they are not yet facing serious debt. They realize, even if only intuitively, that the current balance depends on everything continuing exactly as it is. It depends on continuing to receive the same paycheck. It depends on no major emergency coming up. It depends on no mistake happening in the plan. That sense of fragile balance creates a specific kind of financial anxiety, an anxiety that is not tied to the immediate present, but rather to the constant possibility that something unexpected could dismantle the structure that is keeping everything working. When someone finally understands this dynamic, something very important begins to change in the way that person sees the role of money in their own life. Because for the first time, it becomes clear that the true goal of organizing finances is not just paying bills or avoiding debt, but building a structure in which financial life can keep functioning even when unexpected things happen. That shift in perspective completely transforms the relationship with tools like the credit card, because it stops being seen as an automatic solution and starts being seen as something that needs to occupy a very specific place within the financial architecture. Not as the base of the system, but as an occasional tool. When that difference becomes clear, the person begins to realize that true financial freedom is not born from the available limit on a card, but from the ability to make financial decisions without constantly depending on money that does not yet exist. And it is exactly at that point in the story that many people begin rebuilding their relationship with money. Not just by trying to spend less or earn more, but by completely reorganizing the way financial decisions are made over time. There is a very common belief that follows people for years in their financial life. A belief that seems extremely logical when observed superficially, but that in practice ends up misleading many people who work hard and expect that a chisomi point an increase in income will automatically solve their money problems, as if earning more were the natural key to finally escaping the financial pressure that the credit card tends to create over time. That expectation comes from a simple line of reasoning that all of us make at some point in life. If things are tight today because money is short, then when money increases, there will naturally be more room to calmly organize everything. Pay what needs to be paid, save a little, and finally live without that constant feeling of financial vigilance. For a long time, that idea seems perfectly reasonable because the human brain tends to imagine the future as a more organized version of the present, a place where current problems have already been solved and where there is finally room to breathe peacefully. But there is one very important detail that is rarely considered in that kind of thinking, a detail that completely changes the outcome of that equation. Financial behavior almost always grows together with income. When someone starts earning a little more, life naturally begins to adjust to the new level of available money. And that adjustment does not happen only in big decisions like moving to a different house or changing cars, but mainly in small changes that seem almost invisible at first. Small improvements in the quality of the things the person consumes. Small conveniences that used to seem unnecessary, small comforts that now feel justifiable after so much effort at work. None of those decisions in isolation seems capable of creating a real financial problem. Because after all, income has increased and there is a feeling that now there is more room to accommodate those improvements in the routine. What almost no one notices is that while income grows, the standard of living also starts growing along with it. And when the standard of living grows, the emotional cost of going backward also increases. It is at that point that the credit card begins to take on an even more complex role in the financial life of many people, because it offers an extremely convenient way to maintain the standard of consumption even when the money for the month is temporarily tighter. Imagine someone who spent years working hard to increase their income, finally got a promotion or professional improvement, and began building a somewhat more comfortable life with small improvements that make sense within the new financial reality. Now imagine that in a given month, a bigger than expected expense appears or a sequence of expenses that were not in the plan. At that moment, the brain faces a difficult choice because reducing the standard of consumption immediately feels like a kind of emotional setback, as if all the effort made to improve life were being threatened. That is exactly where the credit card steps in. Again, as an apparently elegant solution, allowing the person to maintain the current standard while handling that financial squeeze over the next few months. The problem is that this solution works so well in the short term that the brain begins to trust it more and more, creating a silent dependence on credit to maintain the stability of that lifestyle. That is one of the reasons why many people who earn higher salaries continue feeling a financial pressure very similar to what they felt when they earned less. Not because they are living irresponsibly above their means, but because their standard of living and their use of credit grew together over time. When that happens, the card stops being just an instrument of consumption and starts becoming a tool for maintaining a lifestyle. It begins functioning like a kind of cushion between the current standard of living and the temporary limitations of monthly income. Whenever a small mismatch appears between what life costs and what came into the account that specific month, the card absorbs that difference and pushes the resolution of the problem forward. As long as that dynamic keeps working, life seems to remain relatively stable, but there is a very important psychological effect happening behind the scenes. The person's future starts becoming more and more committed to maintaining the present. Each new installment that appears, each amount that gets pushed to the next statement, each small adjustment made to maintain the current standard creates a financial commitment that will still need to be handled in the coming months. Over time, this generates a feeling that many people describe in very similar ways. The feeling that earning more money did not bring the peace they imagined. They work more, earn more, have access to more things than they did before, but still feel that money never seems completely free. There is always a part of it that is already committed to installments, to past decisions, or to adjustments made to keep the routine functioning. That realization tends to be uncomfortable because it challenges a very deep belief that most people carry from early on. The belief that a financial problem is always just a lack of income. Of course, income matters, and a lot. But when a person's financial structure is organized around credit, earning more money often only increases the size of the system without necessarily bringing the peace that should come with that growth. It is as if financial life grows in scale, but keeps functioning with the same logic of depending on the card to solve small imbalances along the way. When someone finally notices this pattern, an extremely important question comes up that is rarely asked at the beginning of the financial journey. Does financial peace depend only on how much money comes into the account? Or does it depend mainly on how money is structured within the person's life? That question marks a turning point in the way someone begins to see their own financial behavior, because it shifts the focus from income to the architecture of money. It shows that the real problem was never just spending too much or earning too little, but allowing credit to become the quiet foundation that supports the functioning of the financial month. When credit occupies that central place, any increase in income ends up being absorbed by the structure that already exists, instead of creating real space to build stability, peace, and financial freedom over time. And it is exactly at that moment that many people begin to realize that the relationship with the credit card needs to be rethought, not as a battle of discipline, but as a system change, a change in the way money circulates within their own life. Because as long as the card continues being used as a mechanism to balance the present with the future, the feeling of always running after your own money will hardly disappear completely. There is a very delicate moment in a person's relationship with their own money that is rarely discussed openly, because it does not appear as a technical problem that can be solved with a spreadsheet or a simple calculation, but rather as a quiet feeling that slowly forms inside the mind over time. A feeling that is difficult to explain and even harder to admit to other people, especially when, on the outside, life seems to be functioning normally. That feeling begins almost usually after years of living inside that cycle where money comes in, bills are paid, credit card statements are handled, and the month starts again with new decisions being made on credit, a cycle that does not necessarily involve late payments or out-of-control debt, but that still creates constant pressure on the way money is perceived inside the person's life. At Chisomi Point, usually on a completely ordinary day, a thought appears that many people try to ignore at first. A thought that shows up when someone looks at their own financial routine and realizes that despite all the effort, all the years of working, all the attempts to organize bills, the feeling of financial peace still seems far away. It is not an explicit financial crisis. It is not a collapse, but it is not peace either. It is only a kind of persistent restlessness, a silent question that starts to arise in the mind. Why does it feel like money is never enough to create real peace? That question usually comes accompanied by an internal review that many people do without realizing it, a kind of mental audit of all the attempts they've already made to organize their financial life. They remember the times when they tried to cut expenses, the months when they decided to be more disciplined, the times when they promised themselves that that would be the last installment plan, the attempts to keep better track of the statement. And even so, after so many attempts, the feeling of financial stability still seems fragile. It is at that point that many people begin directing frustration toward themselves. believing that maybe the problem lies in their own lack of control, their own lack of discipline, or their own inability to deal with money the right way. That interpretation tends to be extremely emotionally heavy because it turns a complex financial system into a kind of personal judgment, as if difficulty with money were a direct reflection of the person's own worth or competence. The credit card, in this context, ends up becoming a quiet symbol of that frustration. Not because it is necessarily the only thing responsible for the problem, but because it is present in practically every moment when money seems to slip out of control. The statement arrives every month. The limit is always there. The installments keep running. And each of those elements ends up functioning like a small reminder that the relationship with money is still not completely resolved. The most painful part of this dynamic is that many people living this reality are not irresponsible, are not disorganized, and are not living in a completely impulsive way. In fact, many of them are extremely conscious about money. They think about finances all the time. They try to track the numbers. They try to improve. They try to do things differently, but the more they try to control every detail of financial behavior, the more they realize that something seems to slip through the edges of the system. It is as if they are always trying to reach a point of stability that never fully arrives. That experience creates a very specific feeling that few people can describe clearly, the feeling of silent financial failure. It is not a visible failure. It is not something other people necessarily notice. But internally, there is the impression that somehow money should be more organized than it is. That feeling tends to be even stronger in people who work hard, who make a daily effort to keep life functioning, and who expected that after so many years of effort. Money would finally stop being a constant source of concern. When that does not happen, the brain starts looking for explanations, and often finds unfair answers, blaming the person for something that, in reality, is much more structural than it seems. Because what many people do not realize is that the modern financial system was designed in a way that makes it extremely easy to consume and extremely difficult to feel the real weight of each decision at the moment it happens. The credit card is one of the most powerful tools within this system, precisely because it separates the pleasure of the purchase from the financial consequence of the purchase. That separation creates an environment in which small decisions can accumulate over time without the brain being able to immediately perceive the total impact they are creating inside financial life. When that environment remains in place for years, it can generate exactly that feeling of silent frustration that so many people carry without understanding where it really comes from. The uncomfortable truth that almost no one explains is that many modern financial difficulties are not just the result of a lack of individual discipline, but rather the consequence of a financial environment that was designed to make consumption extremely easy and the perception of cost extremely diffuse. When someone finally understands this dynamic, something very important begins to change in the way that person sees their own history with money. Because for the first time, it becomes clear that the problem was never simply a personal failure. It was never just a lack of willpower. It was never just a lack of financial intelligence. It was, to a great extent, the result of living for years inside a system that encourages immediate decisions while pushing the consequences into the future. That understanding has a deeply liberating effect because it removes a huge part of the guilt that many people carry in silence. It shows that reorganizing financial life does not mean fighting against yourself all the time, but rather reorganizing the environment in which decisions are made. And when the environment changes, behavior naturally begins to change along with it. It is exactly at that point that many people begin to realize that the ultimate goal of money was never to pile up numbers in an account or prove to others that they managed to win financially. The true goal of money has always been much simpler and at the same time much deeper. To create mental peace, to create space to live without that constant feeling of financial vigilance, to create a life in which financial decisions do not have to be made under emotional pressure all the time. When someone begins rebuilding their relationship with money, from that perspective, the credit card stops being the center of financial life. It goes back to being just a tool that may even exist within the system, but that no longer defines the way financial life works. Because true financial freedom is not born from the amount of available limit on a card. It is born in the moment when money stops taking up constant space inside your mind. When a person reaches that point of understanding, when they finally begin to realize that the relationship with money is not only a matter of math, but mainly a matter of environment and behavior, something starts to change in a very subtle way in how financial decisions begin to be seen in everyday life. because for the first time, the attention stops being only on the value of purchases and starts being on the role each decision occupies within the structure of one's own financial life. That change seems small at first, but it has a deep effect because it completely shifts the focus from discipline to the system, from personal guilt to the organization of the environment in which money circulates. For a long time, many people tried to solve credit card problems using only willpower, promising themselves that starting next month they would control purchases better, follow each expense more closely, avoid installment plans, and keep everything under control based only on constant vigilance. The problem with that approach is that it turns financial life into a daily battle against impulses. A battle that requires mental energy all the time and ends up becoming extremely exhausting over the months and years. No one can live well when every small financial decision feels like an internal struggle between the desire to solve something quickly and the fear of creating more pressure for the future. That is why so many attempts at financial organization end up failing, not because of a lack of intelligence or responsibility, but simply because the system the person is living in continues favoring exactly the behavior they are trying to avoid. When the card continues being the easiest path to solve any small financial problem, the natural tendency of the brain will always be to choose that path in moments of exhaustion, urgency, or stress. The real turning point begins to happen when the person understands that the goal is not to defeat the credit card every day with willpower, but rather to reorganize the financial structure in such a way that the card stops being the first solution for every situation. That starts with an extremely important shift in perception. Understanding that future money needs to stop being used to solve the present. As long as the present constantly depends on money that does not yet exist, financial life continues functioning in a permanent state of anticipation, as if each month we're always trying to catch up with decisions that were made before. The first step in this reorganization is not cutting everything out, not living in deprivation, and not turning money into a constant source of anxiety. The first step is creating clarity. Clarity about what is really happening within your own financial structure. Many people spend years looking only at the total credit card statement, but rarely calmly analyze the set of decisions that are running at the same time within that statement. Old installment plans, automatic subscriptions, purchases that have already completely lost the importance they had when they were made. When someone finally looks at this scenario carefully, a very powerful realization appears. A large part of the current financial pressure does not come from the needs of the present, but from commitments created in the past that keep taking up space inside today's income. From that moment on, reorganization starts making more sense, because the focus stops being simply spending less and starts being free in the future from those old decisions. Each installment that ends represents a small piece of financial freedom returning to the present. Each commitment that ceases to exist opens space for the month's money to start breathing again. That way of seeing the process completely changes the emotional experience of financial organization, because instead of feeling like an endless effort to control spending, it starts to feel like a gradual process of recovering space inside your own life. And when that space starts to appear, even slowly, something very important happens inside the person's mind. Financial anxiety starts to decrease. That happens because the brain finally starts realizing that future money is no longer being consumed as quickly as before. There's more predictability. There is more stability. There is less constant pressure. In that more stable environment, the credit card stops being a survival tool and becomes only an occasional option within a system that works even without it. That difference is fundamental, because when financial life works without depending on credit, the card loses that psychological power it had of always seeming like the easiest solution to any problem. The person begins looking at the card in a completely different way, no longer as a natural extension of money, but as a tool that needs to have a very well-defined role within the personal financial system. That role is usually much more limited than most people imagine. The card can exist to facilitate specific payments. It can exist to centralize some expenses. It can exist for convenience, but it no longer needs to exist as a mechanism for balancing the financial month. When that change happens, the emotional relationship with money also begins to transform. That constant weight that used to exist in the mind starts to lessen. Opening the banking app stops being a moment of tension. The statement stops being a surprise, and money finally begins to occupy a calmer place inside the person's life. Not as a constant source of concern, but as a tool for organizing reality more consciously. It is at that moment that many people realize something extremely simple, but at the same time extremely powerful. The true goal of organizing finances was never to have more control over every cent, but rather to recover the mental freedom to live without money taking up too much space inside your own head. Because when money stops being a constant emotional problem. It goes back to being exactly what it always should have been, a tool to make life easier and not something that silently weighs on every everyday decision. If this reflection made sense to you, if at any point in this video you realize that this silent relationship with the credit card also exists within your own financial life, then it was already worth making it this far. Now, I want to know one very simple thing. If you watched all the way to this point and realized that it is time to rebuild your relationship with money in a calmer and more conscious way, comment below the word clarity. I want to see how many people made it to the end and started seeing their own money in a different way. And if this video helped you organize your thoughts about finances a little more, go ahead and leave your like and subscribe to the channel, because every day we talk here about money in a simple, realistic way, without those unrealistic promises that only create even more pressure in the minds of people who are already trying to organize their own financial life. Because at the end of the day, understanding money should not be one more source of anxiety. It should be exactly the opposite. It should be the beginning of a life with much more peace of mind.